Before we get started, allow me to say that if you have come to me for expertly crafted opinions and professional analysis, you've come to the wrong place. I'm not exactly a smart guy, I just like to talk about what I feel, and I feel pretty strongly about this topic. I don't claim to be an expert on anything related to game development, so take my opinions with a grain of salt. With that being said, I do hope you enjoy the video. I'm going to paint a picture for you real quick. Imagine you're a kid, say 9 to 10 years old, who's only just started playing video games for real. You own a Wii, and your favourite games so far have been games like Mario Galaxy and Super Smash Bros. Brawl. But you've been playing something vastly different than those other games for a while now, and although it's taken a long time, you're nearing the end of the game. This game is The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. It's a game like nothing you've played before, filled with adventure and driven by its story. You finally reach the top of Hyrule Castle and face off against Ganondorf to save the world. It's an intense battle, combining everything you've learned during your journey. You deal the final blow, say a tearful goodbye to your companion, and return home to your village from the game's opening. The credits end with a shot of the statue depicting the game's logo. You go to press the A button to move on, but nothing happens. You try all the buttons on your controller, but the game is seemingly frozen. So you quit the game and reload. You find yourself back before the final fight, to which you play again to hopefully fix the glitch. But after everything, it happens again. There is no glitch. It's intended. If it's not obvious, the kid in this example was me. Twilight Princess was my first Zelda game, and the first game I had played that wasn't something level-based like Mario and Sonic, or a party game like Brawl, or, well, Mario Party. I was invested in the story, the world, the adventure, but in the end, it felt like none of it mattered. The fact that you could just get put back to before the game's end really disappointed me as a kid, and still does to this day. I want to feel like everything I did during my playthrough actually mattered, by affecting the world in a way I can actually experience, and not just be shown in a cutscene. This is my biggest pet peeve when it comes to video games, that they can just throw you back to before the final boss, or that nothing really changes once you've beaten the game. Nowadays, I can understand why this is a thing and how it's required by some games due to narrative or gameplay limitations. I still don't like it, and using some examples I'll be showing shortly, I plan to explain why I think it's a disappointing and unfulfilling way to end your game. Please note that I am not saying the game devs who make these games are lazy or whatever. I know that a ton of things go on behind the scenes when it comes to making games, like budget or time constraints, so I don't blame the developers for these decisions. I just wish that this wasn't a thing in games anymore. Let's use Twilight Princess and Zelda games as a whole as our first example, as this series is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to this. As stated before, Twilight Princess was the first Zelda game I played, and while it was the first game I'd played where this had happened, the series has been doing it for a long time. The other games I played as a kid, being Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword, also did this. Now, let's look at why. In Twilight Princess, the ending cutscene shows you dispelling Ganon's influence over the world and saying goodbye to Midna, who was your companion throughout your adventure. It also shows Link returning the Master Sword to its pedestal in the sacred grounds, and then returning to Autumn Village where he lives. Overall, it's an emotional and well done ending, neatly wrapping up the various plot points throughout the story, but as stated before, you don't get to experience this post-Ganon world, you just get booted back to your last save after viewing the cutscene. So, why would Twilight Princess do this instead of having a proper post-game? In our post-Ganon scenario, if you were to continue playing beyond this point, you would lose access to a lot of things. The absence of Midna makes you lose access to fast travel, the wolf transformation, and a few other minor things. You would also lose access to the Twilight World, as Midna breaks the mirror you use to go there. So right off the bat, Link is nerfed pretty hard in what he can do, but we're not done yet. Link also loses the Master Sword, so certain dungeons that require it could not be revisited, and the replacement would be the Traveler's Sword, which is a sword you use in-game before getting the Master Sword and is weaker than it as a result. Last but certainly not least, the monsters located in the dungeons and overworld no longer exist without Ganon, basically removing combat from the game, which, while not the only focus of the game, is still a big part of it. So, crafting a post-game world with all of this in mind would be pretty difficult, right? What's the point of a post-game without these elements? Wouldn't it just be extremely boring? Well, this might just be coming from someone who likes to immerse themselves in games and their worlds, but the idea of a peaceful post-game with no combat is actually really appealing to me. Being able to explore a world that has actually been saved by the hero would be a nice payoff to everything that happens within the story. And with the way the game's mechanics work, you could easily move some things around to have Link retain most of his abilities even without Midna. In Twilight Princess, Midna uses a cursed crystal that Zant, one of the game's antagonists, placed inside of Link to transform him into Wolf Link. In the post-game, Link could just have access to this crystal without the use of Midna, retaining the ability to transform. You may still not be able to fast travel, but what is the point of fast travel in a game world where the peaceful journey between places is the focus? I plan to make a video about fast travel in the future as well, but let's get back on topic. If you really wanted to keep fast travel, you could just say Midna blessed the crystal to allow it to use her old portals or something, therefore keeping fast travel. Okay, what about the Master Sword? Link does return it in the end, so we can't use it, right? Well, why not just have it so that when you go to the sacred grounds again, you could just pull it out again? I mean, why not? Reclaiming the sword could just be treated as a neat little Easter egg, or it could lead to something more like a Trial of the Master Sword, which unlocks a new combat-focused dungeon similar to the one that already exists in-game. And this could also help fix the whole lack of monsters, lack of combat thing. But let's just say that the biggest issue would be the lack of things to do. You could always just have it that some monsters inhabit Hyrule regardless of Ganon, but I personally would not do this. Twilight Princess has a ton of side quests and minigames that are unrelated to the main story and could be done in the post-Ganon world. Hell, you can sink dozens of hours into the fishing minigame alone, like I did when I was a child. There are also a ton of collectibles that are available too, such as heart containers and the various bugs in the game. In all, the game would still have plenty of content, just not as much combat. Another big element of a post-game world like this is that your interactions with NPCs could change drastically, including how, like in the main credits, we see the various children that you rescued throughout your journey return home to the village. You could actually see them in the village in the post-game and get some dialogue from them relating to your journey. More NPCs like this could have their daily routines and lives directly changed by your actions, which would give more opportunities for lore and a more satisfying feeling that you actually did save the citizens of Hyrule. So as for Twilight Princess, at least, with a bit of tweaking, a saved Hyrule could still make for a decent post-game, but even I'll admit that it would be unnecessary for most people who just play for fun and action rather than immersion. And this is asking a lot from a Wii/GameCube game. So what's the point of this discussion? Well, there was one Zelda game which I had a small hope would break this cycle, and that is Breath of the Wild. If you ask me personally, Breath of the Wild is almost impossible to not get immersed in. The game encourages exploration and discovery by design, and being swept up by this sense of adventure can lead to hundreds of hours played. With this in mind, I thought that the game would finally let us play in a post-Ganon world after beating the final boss. But Nope. The game still sends you back to before the Ganon fight. Oh, but at least this time you get a nice little star on your save file. This actually bothers me more than Twilight Princess, as it would take way less effort to implement a peaceful postgame. Now again, this isn't a jab at the developers, but just something I want to talk about. The only thing that would be really lost in a post-Ganon world would be the Guardians, as Ganon's corruption would be gone, but all of the other monsters would remain. If you beat Ganon shortly after starting the game like you would in a speedrun, for example, you would lose access to the Divine Beast dungeons, sure, but that would make sense narratively and game design wise, as Breath of the Wild is designed to be played multiple times. You could easily play the game as intended one time, completing all the dungeons before facing Ganon and seeing all of the narrative, and then beat Ganon early and change the course of the narrative in another playthrough. Breath of the Wild was the perfect candidate for this type of postgame, as the nature of the world itself lends so well to this idea. You could still do side quests, the shrines, the Koroks, the DLC, and more, all in a world without Ganon. There is so much to Breath of the Wild without Ganon being a factor. If you really wanted to keep the Guardians in the game as enemies, you could just have them still running haywire without the corruption, changing the colour of their lights to blue instead of purple. You could just spin it as them all still glitching out after being corrupted for so long. Since you also save Zelda, she could also be adventuring around the world and be found at key locations, similar to Princess Peach in Mario Odyssey, in which you could talk to her for more lore and fun dialogue. However, I'd like to jump back to the whole monster thing for a second. You see, in the game Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns, yes, I'm talking about Final Fantasy XIII, shut up, there is this mechanic in which if you kill enough monsters of a certain species before the end of the game, the last of their kind would become a boss fight, and that monster will stop spawning in-game. Now, imagine in Breath of the Wild, where without Ganon, the Blood Moon stops happening. This would mean that if Link killed every monster in the overworld, they would not respawn. This could be a massive, and I mean massive, post-game quest to liberate Hyrule and bring true peace. And you could even have special bosses spawn after beating all monsters of a species, just like in Lightning Returns. That would be a really interesting way to make a post-game using the base mechanics present. Imagine a super boss Lionel that you can fight after beating all of the others. It would be really cool. Breath of the Wild is such a perfect candidate for this, but of course, this did not happen. I can understand why this type of thing can be hard to implement, and once again, the average player won't even care, but I would like to talk about one more game that I played recently that showcases a much more modern version of this issue, and that game is Ghost of Tsushima. Unlike Zelda, Tsushima does feature a postgame. After defeating Kotal Khan and pushing back the Mongol invasion, you can play the game after beating the final boss. In this postgame, you can complete all of the optional objectives, such as liberating the towns and forts littered around Tsushima to fully remove the Mongols from the island. But that's not what actually happens. If you beat the final boss and fully liberate Tsushima, the Mongols don't actually leave. They still appear around the world just as much as the rest of the game, as if nothing happened at all. The game writes this off as them being stragglers that are fighting for the honour of the Khan or something, but the stragglers shouldn't have access to their full military might as if they still had the support of their leader. While with Zelda you can justify it, you can't really do so with Tsushima. At the end of the game, the main/player character, Jin Sakai, is branded a traitor by the shogun of mainland Japan and is hunted by the samurai. So, just replace the Mongols with samurai. That's it. The enemies already exist in-game alongside regular Japanese bandits and the Straw Hat Ronin, which combined serve as an easy-to-implement and lore-friendly way to keep enemies in the overworld while also making it so that Jin's sacrifice of his honour and standing among the samurai to rid Tsushima of the Mongols doesn't feel worthless. It would also make his sacrifice have more weight, as you would be forced to fight the samurai that you fought so hard to be a part of. With this little tweak to the gameplay, you can add so much more weight to the narrative through player experience, not just cutscenes. You can also replay any mission or side content from the menu if you want to, which lets you fight any enemy type, even Mongols. So, you don't lose anything at the end of the day by removing the Mongols from the postgame. But what about the DLC, I hear you ask? Well, the game makes it clear that the conflict on Iki Island, which is where the DLC takes place, is separate from the main story, while still being linked. You wouldn't have to make any changes to the DLC at all. You could even say that the Mongols fled from Tsushima to Iki after Jin liberated it, as they still have a strong presence there due to the Eagle, the DLC antagonist, taking it over. It would make sense for stragglers to be here even if you beat the DLC, so no changes need to be made here. With just a little bit of tweaking, this issue could have been alleviated completely in Ghost of Tsushima. I was disappointed with Tsushima's postgame as a result of this, and was what prompted me to make this video. Off-script side note here, I wasn't actually disappointed in Tsushima's postgame. I just found it a bit disappointing that, the Mongols still stuck around even though I liberated the areas. The game is still incredibly fun regardless. Sorry, small side note. So, I think I've made my case as far as how most games could implement proper postgames where peace is actually an option. This way, my biggest pet peeve would no longer be an issue. However, despite everything I've said, there are games out there that cannot implement a postgame, pretty much at all. So let's go over those games that have a good reason not to, and as such I obviously don't take issue with. Games such as The Last of Us, Life is Strange, the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Persona, and even the Souls series can't really have a postgame like I've described, just due to the fact that the world cannot exist as it is due to reasons rooted deep in the narrative. In Last of Us, you wouldn't be able to go back to previous locations, nor would there be a reason to, narrative or gameplay-wise. In Persona 5, or even 4 too, the protagonist leaves to go back home after a year, as that was established to happen at the beginning of the game. In the case of the Souls games, they usually end with a narrative death of the player or the end of the world, so you can't really just go on with peace. I mean, it's Souls, peace is not exactly a theme here. Games like this are why New Game Plus exists, and for good reason, although some games do it better than others. So as you can probably tell, since it's fairly obvious, this issue of mine, my pet peeve, is only really persistent in open world games, where the world you traverse is important for multiple reasons. So not being able to experience the impact you make on said world can be extremely disappointing, and I would like to see more games reward the player with an actual world and gameplay change to reflect their in-game efforts, instead of just a cutscene and a trip back to the title screen. I would like to see at least one open world game attempt a peaceful post-game, just to see if I have something here. Now, I know my thoughts have been a little bit all over the place, and this is my first video where I actually have a script in front of me, so I'll summarize my thoughts here. At the end of the day, I wish less games made it so you just return to before the final boss, or are forced to reload your save, or just don't really have proper post-games that reflect the big things that the player does within the narrative. And I feel like it would be a good step in the right direction for games, especially open world games, to have these post-game variations of their world that reflect the narrative shift that beating the game brings on. So yeah, that was the video. Just felt like making this, got this big creative, inspiration, and wanted to give something like this a try. If you have any opinions or counter arguments, I'd absolutely love to hear them. Please comment below. The whole point of these video essay type things is to encourage discussion. But anyway, thanks for watching, and goodbye. After defeating Kotal Kun and Kotal Kun? Oh, Kotal Kun. That's not staying in the video. That is not staying in the video.